Colonial history often focuses on crown governors and royal charters, but the 16th century Atlantic was also shaped by a faction operating entirely outside imperial law. These were the Lançados, a shadow demographic of European refugees who built an independent power structure on the edges of the known world. Examining their history requires moving past simplified narratives of empire to look at the cold, often violent reality of survival on the frontier. In 1536, the Portuguese monarchy under King Manuel I and later João III turned Catholicism into a state weapon. Sephardic Jews and conversos, forced to convert under threat of death, were systematically hunted, stripped of their assets, imprisoned, or burned at the stake. Faced with total erasure, a surviving faction developed a desperate exit strategy. The violence of the Portuguese Inquisition created a vacuum, pushing this targeted minority to execute a dangerous escape rather than face execution in Lisbon. They became the Lançados, Portuguese for the cast out ones, marking their status as self-imposed exiles from the empire. This map shows the coastlines of Guinea and Negritia, covering modern-day Senegambia and Guinea-Bissau, the specific frontier where refugees landed. Survival meant navigating a dual threat. The crown viewed them as fugitives, and the local environment was unfamiliar. To survive the reach of their former empire, the Lançados abandoned European isolation and integrated directly into the African societies of the Upper Guinea coast. They secured protection by taking African wives from local ruling families, forging the strategic alliances necessary to stay alive. This produced a bilingual, mixed-race demographic known as the filhos de terra, or children of the land. Their daily lives blended European architecture, their traditional clothing, with local African customs and scarification practices. Under the protection of Wolof kings, this community eventually practiced Judaism openly, maintaining synagogues, keeping kosher, and circumcising their sons. This reinvention of identity provided the immunity needed for a hunted European minority to transform into a powerful African elite. Excluded from the traditional economies of Christian Europe, the Lançados turned their attention to the wealth of the black market. They operated as middlemen, establishing independent trade networks that intentionally bypassed the royal monopolies of the Portuguese crown. While they traded in weapons and spices, their wealth was largely built on a different commodity. They traded in human beings. This diagram outlines the operation. They used their literacy and European connections to funnel enslaved Africans from local chiefs directly to Spanish and Portuguese ships, avoiding crown oversight. This is documented history. Researchers like Peter Mark and the UNESCO General History of Africa provide the evidence for these alliances. It is a profound irony. People who fled a brutal genocide in Europe became direct architects of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa. By the mid-17th century, the political environment of the African coast began to shift as European empires consolidated their control. Eventually, the long arm of the Inquisition reached their frontier outposts, making their sanctuary increasingly unstable. This image shows a traditional synagogue interior, representing the next phase for many Lançados. They fled the African coast for Amsterdam, reintegrating into the global Sephardic diaspora and returned to open Judaism. As formal colonial administration took over the trade routes, the era of the independent outcast merchant came to an end. The Lançados who remained left a physical and linguistic record of their presence, now embedded in the foundations of modern Cape Verdean and Bissau-Guinean Criollo culture. They remain a study in the paradox of survival, refugees who secured their own safety by exploiting others. Their history shows how the outcasts of one empire can become the foundation for another system of violence.